Hi 511, this is Dr. Keisler, and this week we're going to be discussing internal validity. So hopefully you read the chapter in your text on internal validity and have a little bit of background before we start this discussion. So what is internal validity? Well, we know already that we often conduct research in order to determine cause and effect relationships. We've been discussing that so far all semester. So when we consider internal validity, we're really asking ourselves the question is, can we conclude that the changes in the independent variable caused the observed changes in the dependent variable? In other words, are those changes indeed responsible for the observed variation in that dependent variable? If you're not quite sure about the difference between independent variable and dependent variable, you may want to revisit our discussion a few weeks earlier on variables. So one of the other things we want to think about is, might the variation in the dependent variable be attributable to other causes? So are there extraneous variables interacting or interfering in our study? Is the evidence for such a conclusion, or the conclusion that we come to in our study, good or poor? If a study shows a high degree of internal validity, then we can conclude that we have strong evidence of causality, so that indeed there is a relationship between what is happening with the independent variable and its outcome on the dependent variable. If a study has low internal validity, then we have to conclude that we may have little or no evidence of causality. So what we're going to discuss in the next couple of slides is, what are those things that potentially threaten our internal validity in a study? So threats to internal validity. Threats to internal validity can compromise our confidence in saying that indeed a relationship exists between that independent and dependent variable. The threats to external validity compromise our confidence in stating whether the study's results are applicable to other groups. And so if you remember, that was part of our conversation last week when we talked about sampling, and we talked about those threats in terms of population generalizability and ecological generalizability. So let's talk about some of these threats. So one threat to internal validity is termed subject characteristics, right? So essentially, the selection of people for the study may result in differences, either between individuals or groups that are related to those variables being studied. Sometimes this is referred to as selection bias or a subject characteristic threat. So why is this a threat? Well, if it's not controlled, then these variables may be explained away, or they may explain away whatever differences are found as a result of the study. There are techniques that you can use to control the threat of subject characteristics. Some of those are statistical, and then there are other methods, but those we're going to discuss more in depth when we get to chapters 13 and 16. So some subject characteristics that could potentially threaten the validity could be really any characteristic that a person or a group might have, and those could be age, gender, ethnicity, in terms of students, your fluency, intelligence as determined by some kind of assessment, or your reading ability. So these are all subject characteristics that could potentially be considered threats to internal validity, depending on how your study is designed. So mortality. Mortality is another threat to internal validity. So it's common for a study to lose subjects as the study progresses, right? This is known as the mortality threat. The loss of subjects limits the generalizability and can introduce bias. Mortality is often the most difficult threat to control for in terms of internal validity. But an attempt to try to eliminate this problem would for the researcher to be able to provide some kind of evidence that the subjects that were lost in the study were similar to those who remained in the study. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about a sample study that we can kind of couch some of these examples in. So let's imagine that Jose is an education researcher, and he's developed a new intervention for struggling readers. So he thinks that his new approach will improve the reading ability of struggling readers quicker than some more traditional instructional approaches that have been used. So in order for him to find out if his intervention indeed produces those kind of results, Jose designs a study to test his new intervention in comparison with a more traditional method of reading intervention. So he gets permission to work in an elementary school with 50 struggling readers. He trains the teachers to use his new intervention. One group of 25 struggling readers will get the new intervention, and then the other 25 students will continue to use the school's more traditional approach, which is described elsewhere in his study. All the teachers will use the intervention with a group of their struggling readers, but not with another group. Oops, sorry about that. So after a while, he's going to want to measure the reading ability of the students who are participating in the study again. So let's say he gives them a pretest at the beginning. They get their intervention or his intervention or the traditional intervention, and then he's going to want to study them again with test them again with a post-test. So once he wants to give him that assessment, and then he obviously wants to compare to see if the students in his intervention group or in the intervention group have made more progress in their reading ability than the students who are not receiving the intervention. So let's say that when he goes to measure, he comes back to the school to give that post-test, he discovers that almost half of the students in the intervention group have moved away. This poses for Jose's study the problem of mortality that we just described in the previous slide. So this occurs when large numbers of subjects drop out of one of the groups or one of the conditions. So why could this potentially be a problem or a threat to the internal validity of Jose's study? Well, to understand the issue of mortality, think about this group of students right here, right? Even though they are all struggling readers, some are really struggling more than others. Some may be closer to grade level. Some are boys, some are girls, some are Caucasian, some are African American, some may be English learners, some wear glasses. There's lots of things that are different about those students, right? But what if all of the students who left the study happen to share a similar condition? So let's say that all of the students who left the study and moved away during the course of the intervention also happen to be the lowest scoring readers on that pretest. Now all of a sudden the conditions for his study have changed, right? If in any typical group of struggling readers you would have students who represent kind of a range of reading abilities, even though they're all struggling readers. Well, now in his study, you only have the strongest of the struggling readers left. So if a bunch of the students who are lost all shared that same condition, you no longer have a good representation of what that condition of being a struggling reader actually looks like. All you have left in his study now are the strongest of struggling readers. So this now is kind of why mortality can be a threat to internal validity. It's hard to tell if his intervention can be applied to all of those struggling readers the same, because his group now has changed, or the condition of being a struggling reader has changed. Right? So those guys left. They were the struggling readers. Alright, so let's talk about another threat to internal validity. So location is another threat to internal validity. The actual place or the particular location where you collect your data can potentially create different results or explanations, known as a location threat. So the best way as a researcher that you can kind of try to control for this is to keep the location for where you get your data consistent for all of the subjects in your study. If this isn't possible, which sometimes it is not, the researcher should ensure that those different locations do not favor or jeopardize the hypothesis in any way. So to go back to our example of Jose and the struggling readers, what if the struggling readers are initially tested or given that pre-test in their classroom, but then when he visits again after the intervention, he has to give them that post-test in the auditorium? Are the conditions in the auditorium different than in the classroom? They could potentially influence the data, right? Another internal threat to validity is instrumentation. So, instrumentation is essentially the way that the instruments are used. And so if you think, when we talk about instruments in research, we're talking about those tools that you use to gather evidence or to actually collect the data. So in this case, it is the the pre-test and the post-test. So the way that they use these can potentially be a threat to the internal validity in your study. Some of the ways that they can be a threat are what we call instrument decay, data collector characteristics, and then data collector bias. So going back to Jose, we just kind of gave the example of how location could be a threat, but location and mortality that we discussed first aren't really things that Jose could really control for in his study, right? So we can't force students to stay in his study, and you can't always control what space or what rooms are available, especially if you're dealing, with a school. It might be just hard enough to schedule a day to come in, and so if where he wanted to give the test wasn't available on the day, it might not really be feasible for him to not give the test and try to reschedule that day. So he just kind of goes with, okay, I'll give it in the auditorium. But there is one threat to internal validity that the researcher can kind of always control, and or that kind of rests all on the researcher's shoulders, and that's in terms of instrumentation. So imagine that by the end of Jose's study, he goes back to measure the reading ability of those 50 students again, right? So let's say he pulls out that post-test, and for the group that got his intervention, he tells them to think about how much better they read now than they did at the beginning of the intervention, or how much better they read now than the last time they met with him to take a test. And what he really wants is he wants them to show him how much they've learned. Now, when the other group comes in, the group that didn't receive the intervention, he tells them that even if this reading test is hard, they should still try and do their best. So the way that he just talked to those students might seem like subtle differences, but they can actually have a large impact on the data he collects. It could impact how the students feel about themselves as readers, and then this can in turn influence how they approach the test. It can approach how much effort they put into that test. And so since Jose's just used different instrumentation methods for each group by differing the instructions, he may have altered his results. So to make sure that he, doesn't end up with instrumentation as a threat to validity in his study, Jose would need to make sure that he's using not just that same test to collect data, but that he's also giving the exact same instructions under the exact same conditions for both of those groups. So I also mentioned that data collector bias is a potential threat. If Jose believes that, his intervention is better than the traditional methods that the teachers are using, he thinks the students in the intervention group will improve more than the control group. So this belief is his hypothesis, right? But it can also be a source of researcher bias. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about some of the potential criticisms of stating your hypothesis in your study, right, in terms of bias. But let's say that because of his hypothesis, he's a little more lenient of the answers he accepts on the open-ended comprehension questions on the post-test from the intervention group than he is from the group that did not get the intervention. So the interesting thing about researcher bias is that often it's unknown even to the researcher, right? So maybe Jose doesn't realize that he's grading the intervention group easier than he's grading the other. He's just, he's looking for evidence to support his hypothesis. He sees it and he goes with it. So he's not really realizing that he's displaying bias. In research, because we're dealing with people and researchers are humans, there's always bias. So if there wasn't, we would never be able to create a hypothesis, right? Because our hypothesis is kind of a statement of what we think is going to happen, and so therein lies some kind of bias. But in terms of trying to control this as a threat to internal validity, he wants to control that impact of his bias on his results. So one thing that he could do is he could have someone else, or he could even have two other people score those post-tests, and he would not tell them which group those tests were from. So this would kind of keep his own bias from impacting his results. So you would get, more than one person to take a look, and you would not kind of taint them by giving them any information about which group of students took which group of assessments. All right, so testing. Testing is another threat to internal validity. And a testing threat is when efforts are achieved by the subjects in the study. The results are achieved due to practicing. So this can happen when you have that pre-test, post-test kind of study like Jose has here, right? In an interaction also could cause this by, taking the test and then being more aware of a possible interaction, and it allows the subjects or the students to kind of be more responsive at the end because they kind of already know what is coming. So if we think about Jose's example and in his study, what if during the intervention, many of the questions during the lessons were identical to the types of questions that were asked on the pretest and then later on the post-test? If the students do better on that post-test, is it because the intervention worked, or is it because, potentially now they're much more familiar with the style and the types of questions that are being asked on the test? Did they just have more practice with the items that the test was assessing? So this is something that you always need to be aware of when you have that pre-test, post-test. And there are ways to control for that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about instrumentation in terms of developing those and controlling for them in your methodology. All right, so we've got maturation as another threat to internal validity. And this actually can apply quite often to studies in educational research because we deal with students, who do change over the course of a school year. So change during the intervention time or the time of your study could potentially be due to factors associated with the passage of time rather than with the intervention or what's happening in the study itself. Students can, they can change over the course of a research study. So this is what we call that maturation threat. It's only a threat in studies that use pre and post-test data for their intervention group, or in studies that would span a number of years, or like a number of would track students over a number of grade levels. So the best way that you can control for this is to have that comparison group. So the fact that Jose has an intervention group and then he has that comparison or control group can be a good way for him to try to minimize that threat of maturation in his particular study. All right, so attitude of subjects is another, like maturation, another subject-specific threat to internal validity. And so, the way that the subjects, in this case the students, view a study or view their participation in a study can be considered a threat to internal validity sometimes. So this is, your chapter described it as the Hawthorne effect. Subjects may actually perform better based on a feeling that they're receiving some kind of special attention, right? The opposite could actually occur too, with sometimes if the subjects in the study are not receiving any treatment or any attention at all, this can result or influence them having poor performance. One of the ways that you can remedy this in your study is to provide both groups with comparable treatments, or to try to make your treatment a regular part of the study. So in Jose's case, let's say, for example, the students in the intervention study, they realize that they're all receiving a special type of reading intervention because let's imagine that, they've been struggling readers for a long time, and so they've previously been in small groups where they got that traditional intervention that's being used with the control group. So they notice this time that their lessons are markedly different. Maybe they're more exciting, and they may perform better partially because of this. They may be just more excited because they feel like they're getting something different and something special. On the flip side, then that control group, because they're in the same classroom, may also notice this, and they could feel that they're being denied something, or that they're being slighted, and so they could potentially lose interest in their instruction, or just not be very excited about the intervention that they're receiving, the more traditional intervention. So, in this way, the students could potentially be changing the outcomes not because of the study, not because of what's actually happening with the instructional differences, but they're changing the outcome by their feelings or their attitudes toward the lessons. And so, Jose might not ever know this if it's because of the Hawthorne effect, or if the results that he's getting are because his intervention is actually superior, right? So it's something that we need to consider when we're thinking about, how a treatment is going to be different for different groups in the study. All right, we're getting towards the end here, right? So there's, quite a few threats to internal validity that you need to consider. And of course, you're not actually designing a study, but you are critiquing some studies. And so threats to validity are usually a source of critique or criticism for the studies. So let's talk about regression. A regression threat is possible when change is studied in a group that has, extreme lows or extreme high performance in that pre-intervention stage, right? So just like with the maturation threat, you could control it by using an equivalent or control or comparison group. So, there are many things that can make this happen. There are many things that can make a person do extremely well or extremely poor on a task on any given day, right? You could have a bad day, you can feel ill. These can make somebody do, bad or perform poorly on a task. On the other hand, you could, have gotten a good night's sleep, or you could be feeling really sharp that day, and this could make you do really well on a task or a test. But chances are that over time, you end up with some kind of score that's average for you, right? So some days you might perform really poorly, some days you might perform really well, but usually it's in the middle, and those kind of balance out those really highs, the real highs and the real lows. So this averaging out of scores is called regression to the mean, right? So basically, if your mean is the average score, and you're regressing or moving back towards it after a particularly good or a particularly bad performance, right? You're regressing towards that mean. So why is this? Let's talk about why regression then is potentially a threat to internal validity. So imagine that in Jose's study, some of the students do really, really poorly on his pretest. So they may have just been having a really terrible morning, but the chances are that the next time they do the test, they'll not do as poorly, so that they are regressing toward their mean. So the opposite could also be true too. Some of the kids who do really, really well on the pretest, right, they're likely to end up with a lower score the next time just because they'll be regressing toward their mean. So this is statistics. The math bears it out that this happens. But the reason why this could be a threat is it might be hard for Jose to know whether that intervention is helping or the differences in the two test results are just regressing back towards the mean, right? Of course, the chances of every student in that study doing really, really well or really, really poorly and then regressing towards the mean are pretty slim. But the way that Jose could kind of control for this is the more subjects he has or the more students he has in his study, the less likely it is that regression to the mean is responsible for the final results or the final analysis of his study. So this is one of those reasons why we talk about the importance of sample size, right? So it partially has to do with this idea of regression. Okay, so implementation. This is our last threat to internal validity that we're going to discuss. So with implementation, there's a chance that the experimental group could potentially be treated in ways that are unintended, and this can give them an advantage. So this is known as an implementation threat. And this can occur primarily in two ways. So the first is when different individuals are assigned to implement different methods, and these individuals differ in ways related to the outcome. So this happens often in educational research because you're usually dealing with different teachers, right? So even though Jose trained all of the teachers who were in the study, some of them may have understood it or are better able to implement it because of factors not related to Jose or the study. Another way that implementation threat can occur is when some individuals have a personal bias in favor of one method over the others. So let's say that in Jose's study, the teachers are more excited when they use the Jose's intervention than when they use the traditional method. Or the opposite, let's say that they think his intervention is silly and isn't going to work, and they don't implement it the way that it was intended, or they don't take it very seriously. So either of these situations could easily influence the overall outcome because of the way it was implemented, not necessarily because of the intervention itself. And so this is also always a problem when we're looking at a lot of the research that looks at programs and looks at school reform efforts. It's sometimes not the curriculum or the program or the reform itself that works or doesn't work. It's the way that it's carried out, right? It's the way that it's implemented. So all of these are things that researchers need to be aware of when they're designing their studies. They have to think about ways to control for them. And then you also need to think about them again as you analyze your data and you come to conclusions about your study. There are, different ways that you can minimize threats to internal validity, and I mentioned some of them as we talked about the individuals, but in terms of overall strategies, what you try to do is kind of standardize the conditions under which that study is going to occur. obtain as much information as you can on the subjects of the study, which is often like you'll see a demographic or characteristic data table of participants in the study. You can try to get more information about the details of the study, so be very clear about what you're going to do and how you're going to carry it out. And then you want to make sure that you choose a design that's appropriate for the question that you intend to research. And we've talked about that before, why that's important. So, like I said earlier, you're of course not designing a study at this point, but all of these things are important for you to be able to use while you think about research as you read it, and you analyze and you critique the research that's been done by others.